Can everyone hear me? We're testing our new system. We now have a speaking system. We got some feedback that the corners of the rooms were a little hard to hear, so we have this. And by the way, when we do questions, I will come up and hold the mic for you when you're asking questions so everyone can hear it. Welcome. I'm starting a little early because I want to do a couple of things before a speaker comes up. I'm Mike Ehrman, chairman of the Historical Society. I want to thank many of you who are sitting here and the group as a whole. We've set a new record for memberships. We're larger than we've ever been before, which is over 100. We've had a 90% renewal rate from last year with our membership, which we're very pleased about. The announcements to make are, one, Michael forgot to bring flyers tonight. Check in the back table to remind yourself that the Jewish Genealogical Society will be here next month, that we will have a professor from Pitt speaking, Kathleen Parker, on the history of the Unitarians. She's also a very good speaker in July. We're then going to take August off, and I pronounce this wrong every time, but Salah
Udine,
former councilman who was a close friend of playwright August Wilson, senior moment, will be here in September. We're also working hard on a talk. You know the Thaw family, T-H-A-W, and the Thaw Mansion. We're going to have a talk this next year on the Thaw Mansion and the Thaw family. In a minute, I'm going to do something, speaking of next year, I want to get some quick feedback. But the other thing to mention is our walking tour, June 12th. We've got a nice sign-up list. There is still room. I am going to cut it off at either 25 or 30 mercilessly because it gets too big. So right now, you still have a few weeks to sign up, but you never know what's going to happen and whether we cut it off. There are forms in the back for that. What I'd like to do now, for a few minutes before we go to the speaker, is just, you don't expect this, I just want people to tell me, and it's being written down, what would you like to hear about next year? Just raise your hand and tell me, what subjects would you like to hear? Anita?
I would like to have some information about the Indian culture was here before the Westerners.
Okay. Next question. What else? Any others? Yes, Lou?
The bridges of Pittsburgh.
The bridges of Pittsburgh.
The Homewood Cemetery.
We've done that before. It's probably time to do it again.
Would you do the ethnic groups, the different ethnic groups?
Pardon me?
Would you do anything about the ethnic groups in the cemetery? How it's...
I missed the last one. Did they go into the different groupings? In the Homewood Cemetery. We had a talk. I was away. Does anyone remember? Did they go into the different sections of the cemetery? Was anyone here who remembers that? We'll have to check that out. Other topics that you might like. I know I'm springing this on you. Betty?
How to devise the history of your own block.
How to devise the history of your own block. And or house, but block. Yes?
Restaurants, Pamela's, Eaton Park, local restaurants.
Okay, Pamela's, Eaton Park, local restaurants. We will try again. I'm going to tell you a story. I have tried Pamela's for 3 years, and they are shy. I mean, they say this openly. They're afraid to come in public speak. I tried it. Eaton Park couldn't find anyone that could speak on their history. We will try again.
I think Pamela's is opening up here.
That's right, but that, so far, in that very nice relationship with the people there, they were never willing to agree to talk.
Downtown?
You'd like to hear about the development of downtown Pittsburgh. It's a new one. We haven't thought of that. Yeah. And we've had a request. By the way, if anyone has any ideas on this, because this has been a request for a while, the department stores of Pittsburgh, which would be a very interesting topic, the history of, if we could find some.
Only in defense of Hamilton, when they had the president here and he loved it, I kept saying, put it all over your windows. They wouldn't do it. So
yeah, they're very down to earth.
They are.
And Others? This is your chance. Anyone else? These are great ideas. Betty?
Collecting more from our senior citizens about what this community was like when they were.
Okay, so Betty Collins is one of our vice presidents, and Betty ran for us a few years ago some feedback sessions in which we didn't have a speaker, but members would talk and we recorded it. And that is something that we should do again. Anything else? Yeah.
The theaters in Squirrel.
The theaters of Squirrel Hill, I've tried before, I'd be glad to try again. Betty?
There's always more. The historic houses in Squirrel Hill.
Okay, the individual historic houses in Squirrel Hill. Yes?
Transportation to and from Squirrel Hill.
Transportation to and from Squirrel Hill. Okay. Helen Wilson, who's our other vice chairman, is taking notes, and we will work hard on these because there are a lot of months left to cover. Any others? Yeah.
What about the original roadways, like old maps?
The maps and old roadways, how it looked before, how it was laid out. Okay?
Someone in the door wants to tell you something.
Yes?
The Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad. We're working on a Civil War talk, but this is not, that would be more specialized, the Underground Railroad in this area. Anything else? Thank you. That helps me a lot. We'll go to work. You may not see a full schedule till July or August. It's kind of a rolling business here when we're all volunteers, but at least we know what you're going to get in September, and we'll keep going from there. I, by the way, have off and on talked to you, didn't mention this, about getting something on the Steelers, which we've never had, and it's kind of bureaucratic to get to them, but that's still sort of on my ideal list. We've had the stuff on the Pirates, but not on the Steelers. Okay, on to tonight. Al Mann, our speaker tonight, who's also a member of our group and a strong supporter of us, and we hopefully of him, he leads the East Liberty Historical Society, which also covers Highland Park and Point Breeze and a few other communities, which is why it's keeping its name narrow. Al has come to speak to us before on his neighborhood, but tonight Al volunteered a few months ago to come and talk on the petroleum pioneers of Pittsburgh. Al's was a energy engineer, is that the right way to talk about it? And therefore he knows this field very well, and it's an unusual talk. We're looking forward to it. I am negotiating to have someone come specifically, given all the interest, next year and talk about the history of Marcellus Shale and what's going on there. So this is a nice feed-in. Al, welcome, and thank you for all your support.
Already on.
Testing. Can you hear you? No. It may not be on.
Will she be able to turn the other light off up front?
Well, Mike, thank you very much for your introduction and your invitation to come here and talk. I just have great respect and admiration for you as a group. You are doing things that I don't know if any other local historical society is doing.
You want me to do it?
Having regular meetings like this, well attended, and just very interesting topics, a wide range of materials. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you folks. Our East Liberty Historical Society is really quite small, and we've never geared up to the point where we have regular meetings of this sort. We're just moving in that direction, doing a quarterly meeting with a speaker. So we have a ways to go to catch up with you folks. My background, as Mike mentioned, is in engineering. I'm a Cornell graduate in chemical engineering, and I'm glad to see a couple of fellow chemical engineers here in the in the audience. I worked at the Gulf Research Center for many years, and after that closed, I worked a few more years at the Department of Energy Technology Laboratory in South Park. One of the things that has interested me, just came across it somehow, is that the petroleum industry in this country started in Pittsburgh. Now, I ask you, had you ever heard that? You usually think, in answer to that question, well, that was Colonel Drake up in Titusville. And certainly that was a landmark experience. He started the drilling operation that led to the full development of the petroleum industry in this country. But prior to Colonel Drake, we had a very interesting character who lived in Pittsburgh, and this is where I want to start. So we're going to have an adventure. We're going to go back to the beginning of the petroleum industry in Pittsburgh and bring it all the way out here to Squirrel Hill. So here we go on our adventure. The Seneca Indians used and traded what they called seep oil for hundreds of years. And in this part of the world it was called Seneca oil. They used it for medicinal purposes, sprains, rheumatism. And in the Oil Creek area of Venango County, there were many attempts to recover oil in significant quantities. They'd dig pits and they'd get a few gallons at a time. And they skimmed oil out of these pits and used it for medicinal purposes as early as 1792. There's a lot of folk medicine around the story of petroleum. A man named Peterson in Torrenton brought a petroleum sample, it was seep oil that came up out of the ground, and he brought it to the Hope County cotton factory in downtown Pittsburgh in 1845. And he and some other people combined petroleum with sperm oil to form a lubricant for the spindles at this cotton factory, and it turned to be very successful, helpful at a lower cost than what they were doing previously. Next up. Now, Samuel Kier is the fellow that we want to concentrate on for a few minutes. He was quite a character. He was born near Salzburg in 1813. His father owned some salt wells near Torrenton, near the present location of the PPG plant at Creighton. And the problem with the salt that they got up out of these salt wells was it was contaminated with this nasty stuff called petroleum. And they didn't know what to do with it. It was a nuisance. And they would try to separate the oil, and sometimes they dump it in the Pennsylvania Canal, but the oil greased the tow lines of the barges that they were pulling up and down the river, and at times they had fires from the oil slicks. So it was a mess. Now, Samuel Kier lived in Pittsburgh. He had an express business and it failed. And then he formed another company that operated boats plying the Pennsylvania Canal. And B.F. Jones joined Kier in this boat moving operation. And another person involved was James Buchanan, who together they shipped coal between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. This is the Buchanan who became president. And the B.F. Jones that I referred to was the founder of Jones and Laughlin Steel. So these are kind of key people in our history. Samuel Kier saw the potential of oil as an illuminant and a lubricant, and he skimmed some oil from the brine wells. And then, long about that time, his wife became ill, and the doctor prescribed petroleum. It's not clear in what way they had her use petroleum, whether it was internal or as a external application. Certainly, if the FDA had been around at that time, it wouldn't have been very easy to prescribe it as an internal medication. Now, Kier got very fanciful in his advertising. He turned out to be quite a promoter. He had an advertising circular promoting the medicinal value of this petroleum stuff. It's a remedy of wonderful efficacy. The lame would walk, the blind could see. It cured rheumatism, gout, neuralgia, and it was put up as it flows from the bosom of the earth without anything being added or taken from it. These were the flyers that he was passing around. He came up with another little advertising piece that was called a banknote, and it said that oil discovered in 1848 in boring for salt water near the bank of the Allegheny River, about 400 feet below the Earth's surface. This oil was pumped up with the salt water, floats on top, is drawn off into barrels, bottled in its natural state without any preparation or admixture. And on this banknote, he shows derricks, which are really derricks that are pumping brine, salt solution, up out of the ground. But keep that in mind, because we're going to go back to the derricks. So a little more of his advertising fancy, the healthful balm from nature's secret spring, bloom of health and life to man will bring. As for her depths, from her depths the magic liquid flows to calm our sufferings and assuage our woes. Now here's his banknote. See if you can bank out the derricks that are in the corners there with the fire. Well, particularly in that top center picture, and then he has the 400, which meant to imply some kind of a monetary figure, like $400 on his banknote, but he's capitalizing on the fact that it came from 400 feet down to the ground. Now, this was a very significant piece of information, you might say, advertising though it was, which led to a lot of developments in the history of petroleum. Here he put up this rock oil, and there's a copy of the wrapper in which it was sold. They were all over the east here. They had 50 sales agents at peak. Peddlers went around in highly decorated wagons. They sold half-pint bottles all over the Northeast. It turned out not to be profitable because of high distribution costs. So finally, Kier stopped selling from wagons and he started selling to pharmacies. And this is significant, as you'll see in a minute. Now, we're going to introduce another person, George Bissell, a new player. Bissell was a lawyer, worked in New York City, was a Dartmouth graduate in 1845. Now he saw a Kier banknote in a drugstore window on Broadway in New York City around 1856. Let me remind you of all these dates. These are long before the Drake well was drilled, which wasn't until '59. So when Bissell visited Dartmouth, he saw a sample. I think maybe we skipped it. Did we skip one? Well,
Ralph, can you go back?
here. Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I skipped that first bullet point. The thing is that there was a doctor in Titusville who was surrounded by oil, as everybody was aware at the time. Again, it was seep oil that came up out of the ground. And he took a sample and sent it to the chemistry department at his old alma mater, at Dartmouth. Now we can go to the next slide. And when Bissell visited Dartmouth, he saw that petroleum sample and recognized that it looked similar to Kier's medicinal petroleum. So he got on the job real quickly and leased some land from Dr. Brewer. This was the first oil lease in history. He paid $5,000 for a 99-year lease for 105 acres to prospect for petroleum. Then he sent a sample to Professor Silman to analyze, to see what could be done with this petroleum. Silman, a chemist, reported that they could make profitable recovery of kerosene and other products. And that attracted a lot of investors. Now, the consequence of that is that they needed a dependable supply of petroleum. So Bissell organized the first oil company, Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company, in 1854. It was still several years before Colonel Drake's activity. Now, when Bissell looked at this ad showing the derricks and the 400 feet, he conceived of the idea that drilling for oil underground, the same as is done for brine, would be a way to go. People were very skeptical about it. Nobody really bought the idea, but a group of businessmen organized by Bissell got hold of Edwin Drake. This is where Drake comes into the act. They sent him to Titusville in 1857, and Drake was in agreement with the drilling concept. And here's another connection. He went back to Toronto and hooked up with a brine driller that worked with Kier. The famous Uncle Billy Smith was the driller of the line, and they got together, I think somewhat reluctantly on Uncle Billy's part, but finally he got involved and he drilled the first oil well in 1859 using a 5-inch diameter of pipe. It was came in at 69.5 feet deep and flowed about 20 barrels per day. The technique they used was to have the drilling tools inside the pipe. It was called the drive pipe method. And that set the stage for many future developments in petroleum exploration and production, and as well as involved with our famous and controversial topic of Marcellus shale. But that's another whole story. Now, Bissell became wealthy through the business of producing and selling oil, got involved in banking, railroads. The only other thing we know about his subsequent activities is that with his money he endowed a gymnasium building at his alma mater at Dartmouth. Now, Kier started to get a little clearer idea of what was going on with petroleum, so he sent a sample to Professor Booth at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, a man who subsequently became president of the American Chemical Society. Dr. Booth's advice was to distill the oil, crude oil, to produce kerosene aluminum. And it turned out that that's what worked. And it became a replacement for whale oil. And the group that did this really is credited being the first to save the whales, because the whale oil was becoming very expensive and scarce. So Kier, being the entrepreneur that he was, set up a 1-barrel cast iron whiskey still at 7th Avenue and Grant Street, downtown Pittsburgh, at the site of the Bissell U.S. Steel building, UPMC building also known as the, and this was the first crude oil distillation unit ever to operate in the Western Hemisphere. And they sold the kerosene as carbon oil. There was a problem though. The carbon oil burned in existing lamps was smoky and smelly. So Kier went ahead and invented a kerosene lamp that eliminated the odor. And he manufactured and sold the lamp, and demand finally increased, and people started using Kier's kerosene because it was cheaper and worked better than other illuminants. Business improved, and he went to a 5-barrel wrought iron still, and he put it in a building, a 1-story building, down in that area off 7th Avenue. And that still, the larger 5-barrel still, is on display at the Drakewell Museum. They went right ahead and started producing petroleum distillates. And when Drake's Well came in, they were able to start distilling it in their unit. Now, there was a problem with odor and fire concerns, so the city of Pittsburgh required Kier to take his operation out of the city. So we went way up out of town to Lawrenceville and set up a refinery there that operated for many years. In the move from downtown Pittsburgh to Lawrenceville, the 1-barrel whiskey still that had been used initially was stolen. Now, when you go to the Drakewell Museum, there's the 5-barrel still that's built by Kier in the late 1850s. Okay, another picture of it there. There's a historic marker on the path that goes behind the U.S. Steel building up toward Chatham Center that commemorates the building of the Kier Refinery and what it accomplished. And in the next slide, now Kier, as enterprising as he was, he didn't patent his still or his lamp, and he earned very little for his petroleum efforts. At one point he was involved with an oil refinery in Beaver County, but he can be credited, Samuel Kier can be credited with the opening up the new field of crude oil refining. And along with the man named Louis Peterson who we talked about earlier, the use of petroleum products as an industrial lubricant. Other things he was involved with, he as I mentioned, B.F. Jones, who was his partner, was one of the founders of the forerunner of Jones and Laughlin Steel. And he worked in fire brick and other enterprises, coal mining, pottery, insurance, and banking. And here's his grave marker in Allegheny Cemetery. What money he did make was considerable, and he was a great philanthropist. He supported a lot of causes like churches, hospitals, and so forth. Okay. Another character that we have to bring into the act here. Now, this is Charles Lockhart. He was born in Scotland. He emigrated to America as quite a young man. He worked as an errand boy and then a clerk for a man named James McCulley, who did dry goods and produce in downtown Pittsburgh. And he became a partner along with William Frew, that's a familiar name here, a fellow clerk. They became partners in McCulley's operation. The way Lockhart got involved in the oil business was that a man named Isaac Huff floated down the Allegheny River on a skiff from Toronto with 3 barrels of crude oil, which were a byproduct of his salt well. And Huff appeared at McCulley's store downtown Pittsburgh. Lockhart started his entrepreneurial growth at that point, because he bought the oil for 31.25 cents a gallon. Then he turned right around and sold it to Samuel Kier. They were acquainted, they were friends, co-workers. They sold it to Kier. And then Kier turned around and refined the oil in his little unit. Lockhart really started to get involved then, because he made a contract with Huff that Lockhart would buy all the petroleum that Huff could produce for 5 years. And this was the first recorded instance of buying and selling oil ahead of production. Lockhart later bought quarter interest in Huff's well and finally assumed full ownership in 1853. Now, after the Drake well success, here we start to have the interaction between Drake and the distilling people in Pittsburgh, because they had the access to Pittsburgh by barging oil from Titusville down the Allegheny River. And initially Samuel Kier did the distillation. And Lockhart got interested in the production and exploration side of oil too. He started drilling for some oil wells up around Titusville, and it said that at times he used a divining rod to find where the oil was. So then he got out of the salt business, and what he had to work with was some of the oil, some of the kerosene that was distilled off small quantities of petroleum in Kier's stills. And Lockhart went to Liverpool in England in 1860 with a gallon can of crude oil and a gallon can of distilled oil from Kier's refinery. And he got an audience with Queen Victoria and demonstrated to her that the petroleum, you could operate a petroleum lamp with the distilled product from the oil. And that was the opening of the oil trade with England. And while Lockhart was over there, he met Jane Walker of Scotland, and Later on, he went back to Scotland, married Jane Wilk, returned to Pittsburgh, and went into oil refining in a big way. Lockhart, with William Frew, whose name we've mentioned before, built the first major oil refinery in the United States, right up here in Highland Park, about a mile from where I live. It's called the Brilliant Station, and it was the first effort on anybody's part to run a petroleum distillery on a commercial level. The cooling water for cooling the condensers in the refinery was obtained by gravity from a reservoir which is now called Lake Carnegie in Highland Park. They ran 78,000 barrels a week, I said, by the time they really got going. And so then Lockhart and Frew got busy buying up other refineries. Other refineries started to grow up in the Pittsburgh area. The Brilliant Refinery remained on the city maps through 1872, 1876, 82, and 90. It's not clear how long they actually kept operating. There's no trace of that refinery left. But then he branched out and set up a refinery in Philadelphia, and from there he started shipping petroleum products to Europe, really initiating the oil trade with Europe. By 1872, Lockhart owned 7 refineries, and there were about 60 refineries in the area. But that led to excess capacity, and that wasn't a very healthy situation. So along came another person we've heard of, John D. Rockefeller, who somehow hooked up with Charles Lockhart. And this, I apologize for this particular slide because it's not up to date. I had changed it, but somehow it didn't get on the computer. It was actually in 1868 that John D. Rockefeller and Charles Lockhart formed the Standard Oil Company. Famous name. It was founded in East Liberty in 1868. Then they went on up from there. Lockhart became president of Standard Oil. Then there were legal issues. It was a matter of restraint of trade, and all those men were indicted for conspiracy, but it was settled out of court, and I honestly don't know how it was settled. But Lockhart became a director of the Standard Oil Trust, and he was president of Atlantic Refining when the trust was finally dissolved. But according to Rockefeller, Lockhart was one of the most experienced, self-contained, and self-controlled men in business. Lockhart branched out. He got into other companies, Lockhart Iron and Steel, some steamship lines, mining, lumbering, locomotive, president of the National Bank of Commerce, several other enterprises. Okay. Right. Next. Oh, okay, here we are. Now, his wife died in 1900, and Lockhart retired in 1900. His daughter married a McCune. They were involved with what was Union National Bank and became National City Bank, which now has gone away, but that was another whole outreach of their business enterprises. Lockhart built a palatial home on North Highland Avenue, which had a great art collection. He was way ahead of his time in the quality of art that he exhibited in his home. That home was finally demolished after some years after his death, and the property turned over to the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, which is a major building landmark on North Highland Avenue. One of his business principles was to never incur debt. So it's said. His estate was phenomenal. He was a great philanthropist, but he kept quiet his philanthropic efforts. So you can't find really very much about what it is he endowed, but it was a lot. Hospitals, churches, schools, and he was credited as having kindly and generous impulses. Buried in Allegheny Cemetery. Now we have another player. We get into the Mellons. And there's a rivalry here that you may not be aware of. There's some details on Mellon's history, but William Larimer Mellon became involved in oil production as early as 1888 in the western Pennsylvania area. He shipped crude oil to France via Bayonne, New Jersey, first by rail and then pipeline. So he's another one that initiated or got involved in international oil trade. It was W.L. Mellon who conceived of the idea of an integrated oil company, including production, refining, and marketing. But he lost interest in that. He sold that business to Standard Oil. Then he went into the streetcar business. Now, here's a couple of other well-known Mellon people. Andrew W. Mellon and Richard P. Mellon. They were sons of Judge Thomas Mellon, and they got involved with a couple of characters named Guffey and Gailey, and who had prospected for oil in Texas. They developed the Spindletop oil field, which was famous back in the very early days of the 20th century, and the Mellon family bought the Guffey and Gailey interests and went to town. They reorganized their efforts as Gulf Oil Corporation in 1907, and then the oil started to run out at Spindletop, Texas, so they quickly went to Oklahoma and built a 400-mile pipeline to bring Oklahoma crude down to Texas for refining. W.L. Mellon took over Gulf Oil operation. They pioneered in many aspects of refining technology. They built this is a misnomer, they built the world's first drive-in gasoline station, and that's right up here on Bond Boulevard in East Liberty. There's a historic marker that shows where that station was. They were the first U.S. oil company to invest in Kuwait. And of course, that's had its ups and downs over the years. They expanded very steadily, but finally Gulf Oil Company was purchased by Chevron, which was one of the original Standard Oil companies. So the rivalry stopped there. There are a lot of things that the Mellons have done with their money. I mean, they were involved in Gulf and Alcoa, many other large companies. They built the Mellon Institute in 1913, or started then, and then they built the current home of the Mellon Institute in the 1930s in the depth of the Depression that cost them millions of dollars. And one of the projects I'm involved with in the American local chapter of the American Chemical Society is doing a history on the Mellon Institute, that magnificent Grecian temple on Fifth Avenue in Oakland. They put a lot of money into a lot of other things. The National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., Carnegie Mellon University, Graduate School of Business at Carnegie Institute, and a Mellon offspring was a major benefactor of Carnegie Mellon University, Pittsburgh Symphony, Carnegie Museum. What I wanted to show you, and unfortunately it got lost in the shuffle here, is that there's one other player, a petroleum industry player, that is a key to this development that I wanted to share with you. And I'll just tell you what it was. There's well, we have to back up just slightly. Thomas Marshall Howe was the founder of the Chamber of Commerce in Pittsburgh around 1850. He was a prominent businessman. He built a mansion up on top of the hill above Fifth Avenue at Highland on what has become the Chatham University campus. He had a beautiful mansion up on top of the hill, which which was part of his endowment, went to Chatham University. What I'll do is I'll later, after the session, I'll show you some printed material I have on that. Now, after Howe's death, there was a man named Benedum, Michael Benedum, who was the world's top wildcatter. That means he would go after oil and find it where nobody else could, and he took chances on it. But by luck, intuition, and so forth, he generated a tremendous oil business and became very wealthy. And Michael Benedum, when he, after Howe's death, Benedum built another mansion in the same location. He tore down the Howe mansion, built the Benedum mansion in 1911, and that was a very prominent feature of the Chatham University campus. Now, in much more recent years, after Benedum's death, the property was willed to the university, and one of the things they did was, in much more recent years, what was left of the Benedum mansion was turned into condos, and that still exists. But there was a carriage house associated with the Benedum mansion, and that was torn down, but before its demise, the carriage house housed the infant toddler center of Squirrel Hill. It was called the carriage house because that's where it was located. Now, it finally was relocated from the infant toddler center was finally relocated from campus to the building that's now called the Whiteman Center, the Whiteman Community Building, where it's very much in existence and going strong. My wife, who's in the audience here, worked at the carriage house for about 15 years, and they've done a wonderful job in providing infant toddler services here in the East End. So that's the story. That's how we get from petroleum pioneers in downtown Pittsburgh to Squirrel Hill. And I'm glad you've been able to share that with you. Let me mention a couple of things. Our historical society in East Liberty published our book on the history of East End, and you folks have done Squirrel Hill, which is another great job. And I have a few copies of this if anybody's interested. The Lockhart Refinery, so-called brilliant refinery, is in here. It's a rare photo. You can't find these anywhere else. And Lockhart's mansion and the theological seminary and all, they're in this book. And another thing we do in our East End Historical, East Liberty Historical Society, is we put out quarterly bulletins on various individual topics. And the latest one just came out a month or so ago. We did is on Thomas Marshall Howe. And if you've ever noticed the Howe Springs on 5th Avenue near Highland, that was named after Howe. And there's Howe Street, and the Howe name is all over the place. So these two, we're glad to share these with anybody that's interested, and that's where we are. Glad to have any questions about our petroleum story.
There's a Lockhart mansion on on 4th Street. It's now Temple Sinai. Is that Lockhart associated with the oil Lockhart?
Tell me again where that is?
It's right on Forbes Avenue down here a few blocks.
Could well be the same family. I don't know that. That's in fact, I haven't run across. Yes, sir.
How did Mr. Westinghouse get the idea of having a gas well in the back of his house on Penn Avenue there?
Well, that's a good question. Westinghouse was very curious and very innovative. Now his mansion was in North Point Breeze, a couple of blocks north of Penn Avenue. The property is vacant now. The mansion was torn down many years ago after Westinghouse's death. But he was involved in all kinds of things. He pioneered in gas wells, and in fact, it was that gas well that he drilled right there in his property that led to the formation of the Equitable Gas Company.
Yes.
Alan.
Yeah. Just because you have a salt well doesn't mean you have oil.
That's correct.
But there was a big salt operation here in Squirrel Hill down Saline Avenue down there.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Is there any oil down there?
I don't know.
Do you hear the question?
Yeah, okay. Good point. Is there any oil associated with the salt well that was down in Saline Avenue in Squirrel Hill? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
Mr. Kier had his brickworks in Salina, Pennsylvania, a small village in Westmoreland County.
Okay.
About 5 miles west of where he was born, near Salzburg.
Oh,
The Kier brickworks, and there's a street in Salina, PA called Kier Street.
I had read about that, but I never knew where it was.
Small street, residential street.
Thank you. That's interesting.
Sure.
There was a question.
No,
From what you were saying, are we to suppose that there were actual oil pipelines under the Atlantic before the turn of the century?
Oh, no, that was never done. It was shipped by tanker
Okay.
from the U.S. to Europe.
Purpose-built tankers.
Right. I think they had a question here.
Just this minor question. Was kerosene named for care?
No connection at all. It has a Greek origin. It has something to do with its combustion characteristics. I don't know. Perry, do you know that?
No question in this room is minor.
No,
I don't think it anything to do with it.
Maybe, Roger.
No, I don't know. I have another question.
Go.
You mentioned thermal cracking was done in 1861. How sophisticated was that?
Not very.
What did they do? Briefly.
Just, I've been interested in that, and I don't know, but apparently they just boiled the oil hard enough to get some cracking going. It wasn't catalytic.
Okay.
I know that. Lockhart even has a patent on the apparatus that they use, the equipment. Alan?
I thought that they were refining oil in Europe quite a bit before this, in Hungary or someplace like that. And one of the plants up the river was actually modeled on a European plant.
Did you hear that? One of the plants here was modeled after a European. By the way, how many of you have ever been up to Titusville, Oil City? Okay. There's a very good museum and good exhibits up there. And it's too far away for us to have a lecture on, specifically on up there, but it's a very interesting day trip.
Well, that leads to another thing I was going to mention, which is that unfortunately it didn't show on this presentation, but there are a few of us old-timers that are active in the American Chemical Society. A couple of them are here with me tonight, and about 2 years ago, we instituted a program to recognize the petroleum pioneers of Western Pennsylvania through the American Chemical Society, which has a program on historic landmarks. And we organized it here in Pittsburgh and had a major event about a couple of years ago. One day, the place that we had it was at the John Heinz History Center, and we had a major symposium, all-day symposium on energy-related issues, and it was there that we received from the president of the American Chemical Society a plaque commemorating the work of Samuel Kier, who was the first person to do anything significant in distilling oil, at least that we know of in the United States. Yes, there may have been similar things going on separately in Europe, but he did it here in a rather unique way. And one of the outcomes of that celebration was that we received this commemorative plaque, and we were given the opportunity to mount it. And Mordecai Treblow, who's here with me, and another one of our colleagues, and I participated in the mounting of that plaque. Anytime you're downtown on 7th Avenue, right at the corner of Grant Street, our commemorative plaque is on the wall there, the wall outside the U.S. Steel Building. And what I wanted to show was a picture of us doing that commemoration event. Got lost in the shuffle.
I have a question. You mentioned Rockefeller, which everyone always takes notice of. That was an Ohio family, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah, they came from Cleveland.
How did they reach across? It was with Lockhart, you said that
Somehow Rockefeller heard about Lockhart and came to Pittsburgh, and they teamed up and put together the Standard Oil Company right in my little neighborhood of East Liberty. Fascinating story. Yeah, Perry.
This was maybe slightly off the track, but they had this Civil War display of Pennsylvania that came through by the Heinz History Museum this weekend. And what was interesting, you know, we got this movie showing conspiracy about John Wilkes Booth. And one of the guys there told me that John Wilkes Booth was an investor in this oil company called, I don't know what it was, a Dramatist Oil Company, and they were involved in drilling in Titusville. So,
Really?
yeah, I found the whole thing sort of surreal.
Yeah, I should say. Let's see, Helen, did you have something?
Anything else? Anything else? Hal, that was marvelous research. Thank you ever so much.
So, anybody wants to look at a copy of our book or our bullets?
Books are available, membership blanks are available, walking tour blanks are available, and we don't kick you out right away, so you can stand and chat as well. Thanks as usual.